Thanks for bearing with us. We'll be doing the slides off of a phone, so we'll also present some mobile stuff in the meantime. Just a second, I have a lot to say, and I don't want to miss a thing. No, okay. So I'm very glad that my colleague Cosmin earlier mentioned mobile devices and that sometimes they have connectivity issues, because it may come as a surprise to us that oftentimes when the internet is not working for us properly, it's not because of our mobile devices, it's not because they're old, it's not because of the browsers we use, it's not Internet Explorer all the time. And it's also not even JavaScript or CSS, the usual suspects nowadays. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Dragos Filipovici. I spend most of my working time at MHP. I build and maintain and audit web applications. And today we'll talk about HTML. And not just HTML, we'll talk about semantic HTML. We'll see what that means in a bit. It's not a hot new technology. It's something that I think we've forgotten and that we may need to refocus once again. We will check out the consequences and what happens when we don't cater to this side of the web. So about a year ago, we were talking about some hotter technologies. We're talking about web applications that go beyond the outline of a web browser and try and solve connectivity issues as well as diverse user experience issues. They're called progressive web apps. And yeah, we covered quite a bit then. And then we realized that, okay, these are very hot new stuff. These are advanced technologies. But at the end of the day, a progressive web app is still, I didn't change that yet, but it's still only a web app. And that means that at its basis, it has HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And if at least one of these languages carries with it potential showstoppers, if the code is not written properly, it's not a good use of our time to implement progressive web apps and a lot of stuff on top of that faulty code. Yeah. So before we dive into these languages, can we please have a show of hands? Raise your hand if you've ever heard of them. CSS, JS, HTML. Okay, and keep your hand raised if you also know the difference between each of them. Perfect. Okay, we won't go through the details. JS basically elevates a simple website to a web application. It makes it interactive. CSS takes care of structuring our layout, making it fit a diverse range of screen sizes. And HTML, let's break here. HTML, we rarely even talk about HTML anymore. If you follow the industry at all you get is JavaScript every day. CSS every now and then, more recently CSS and JS, but rarely HTML. Even the most common conception is that it's just raw text being passed around from the server to the client, right? If we get more context, we understand that, okay, it's really just a lot of information that's processed, it's personalized for the user, but it's just raw content, right? Well, not exactly. If we really focalize, we will understand that HTML is not really that content. It's not what the content is. It's what it represents. So basically, the definition of it is that it's a language that helps us structure and give a hierarchy to our content and break it down into chunks depending on their meaning. So not just shifting content to one side or the other. Yeah, so also include a definition from MDN. So this is the second phrase from the definition. And I found it quite interesting that it says, it defines the meaning and the structure of web content, because usually when we think of HTML, as I said, we don't usually think of it in such deep terms, like meaning and content. Really, it's just HTML, right? But yeah, it says it right there, meaning. And you may wonder, meaning for who? So people, we get the meaning as we read the content, right? We understand the meaning as soon as we read it. So why do we need to define it again then? It's not for him. We need to define meaning because, as we will find out soon enough, if we don't specify the meaning of our content and explain it to the devices that display that content for us, so if we don't make the devices understand the meaning before we do, we will see that we may have issues either understanding or working with that content. So yeah, at best case scenario, we'll need to work harder to understand it. And at worst, sometimes we may not even find that content at all, or if we will find it, we may not even be able to use it at all. Okay, so in the article, I've mentioned about 7 categories. I've restructured them a bit here, so they're a bit more digestible. Yeah, we mentioned meaning and the structure of the resulting content. I think, oddly enough, although this may be the most obvious, this is the most overlooked consequence. And yeah, let's make, still, we may not be getting the full effect of this, but let's do a quick exercise so we make sure we do. Let's, for a second, think of what would be the ancestor of an HTML document. Any ideas? The first thought that comes to my mind is a book. In order to be... I even crashed. I almost crashed harder than you did. Okay, so to be more in the theme of the event, we can think of a book, but we can also think of a magazine. I'll just put this for a second. So for a second, just to make an analogy of what it means when we write this HTML that is just a div soup or just gray elements and we don't use semantics at all, think of this magazine and think what it would look like if it would not be in this shape, if it would not be organized in pages, if it would not have a title, author, release date, a table of contents. Then dig deeper, we'd probably get like a huge sheet of paper, right? Or a scroll like in the old times. It's not even funny. So this is what a lot of web apps look like these days. Also, if you go into an article, another article. If you go into an article, what would it be like if it had no title here, no images, and think if it had images, no way it would have image captions, no footnotes, and no bolded text, no italics, and so on. Okay, this may seem like over-dramatizing, but this is what a lot of web applications look like nowadays because all of our focus is on JavaScript and CSS, and we forget to actually mark the content and define the structure of the content, and basically use HTML. I'm careful now. And basically use HTML for the purposes that it was built for. Okay, we'll go back. This was the first, and basically the first consequence when we're not using semantic HTML. The second, this is a direct correlation of the first, because search engines scour the web, and they use the hierarchy that we define in our HTML documents to understand what each chunk of our document means. And basically, they grade the content in our documents depending on the tags that we put. So if we put content into paragraphs, it will rank lower than in heading tags. So our web content will take a hit if we don't use semantic content. And if our content will not be found, it won't be used. Going further, let's use this point. So if it won't be found, it won't be used. Okay. Then let's take it from the perspective of a user. Are users able to find the content? If they're not, well, the story pretty much ends right there. But if they are able to find the content, then we can have more possibilities that we can explore. So if they can find the content, we need to make sure that they can also understand the content, and that also they can interact with that content. So let's unpack these two. What do we mean by can they understand the content? When we don't use semantic HTML, it's possible that we compromise our own content. So for things for devices and technologies like screen readers, as well as some more applications that we'll get into, we may be hiding essentially our information. So screen readers, when we use only paragraphs and only divs and don't use all the semantic tags, they may be missing entire chunks of content. Excuse me. And as well, have you ever used on your mobile device when you want to get rid of all the advertising and the navigations, the reader mode in Safari, or the, yeah, there you go. Or in Chrome and Android, I think it's called Simplified View. Yeah, they are really useful. They're also on the latest Apple Watch. And even Apple introduced that in their developer talks in order for the Apple Watch to properly read, as all of these apps and the screen readers, to properly read the content, to display the title of an article, the author, and the publish date, we need to use semantic HTML for that. Okay, so we cover what happens when we want to understand the content, what happens when we want to use that content. So for using HTML, we have something called input tags. Those allow us to put in text, numbers, emails, and so on. So again, screen readers, if we don't mark those inputs properly, if we don't define their type accordingly, they won't be able to help us. Very common practice is to no longer use even buttons because they're seen like classic or something, and people just use divs with click handlers attached to them. When we use that, screen readers won't be able to even know that they are buttons on the page. They'll just see them as chunks of space. Also, yeah, let's just keep that for 1 minute. 1 second, not just 1 minute. We think of screen readers, usually when we think of these notions, okay, this is accessibility, right? This is what everybody knows that accessibility is. It's just screen readers, assistive technologies, and keyboard support, best case scenario. That's where most people usually end their definition of accessibility. A little less known fact about accessibility is that it also covers like significantly increased ease of use on mobile devices. And as well as watches, not just phones. To explore this, okay, awesome. To explore this, we will do a very quick demo. I just prepared some slides, some inputs. I will try and share my screen, see if the gods of Chromecast are with us. Yes, okay, there, awesome. I'll just show you the difference between using inputs that are generic and inputs that have the according type set. So here we see the first. This is just a generic input type text. When we open it, we have the normal keyboard. There it is, okay. On credit card numbers, this is a very fun topic. I'll let you explore more in the article, but we get the normal numeric keypads. On numbers, again, numeric keypads. On some browsers on desktop, you also get like little arrows here so you can increment and decrement. You may have guessed that that's why we don't use input numbers on credit card numbers, because we don't want to increment with one value your credit card number, right? Okay. On telephones, we get the standard T9 with the small letters. On emails, it's a slight difference from the generic text, as you can see. I'm switching. But now on the email, if you look here, the comma changed with the @ symbol. And on URLs, I tapped here, the dot key changes to a slash key. So some of them are more minute and subtle changes that just help you more easily input data. Some, like in the credit card number, this is my personal favorite, because when you mess one digit here up, you got to fill in the entire form again. These are more significant stuff, right? Okay, we'll quickly jump back to our presentation. I am hurrying up. Back to slide 1, awesome. We just have a final negative effect of semantic HTML to cover before we dive into the outro and the ending. Yeah, so you may have wondered, even voice assistants, they are also impacted by semantic HTML. Sure, there's a mountain of technologies feeding into those virtual machines, voice assistants. They get data for us, they perform actions for us, and if we don't write our semantic HTML, basically we're feeding less valuable data to them, and they will be less valuable to us. Another quick tip is that code is also much easier to maintain when you write it semantically. So we may wonder, how did we get here? HTML5 brought the focus back to semantic HTML like 5 or 6 years ago. So this is what is typically called a div soup. This is a header, paragraph, article, figure. So this is the difference between non-semantic and semantic HTML. Even though HTML brought the focus back to it a couple of years ago, we developers were still are very, very focused, and priorities are very high on JavaScript and CSS, and they're rarely so in HTML. The second reason, I think, is because there are no errors, no compile time errors get thrown when you just write normal HTML and non-semantic HTML. So the web is permissive like that by design, but we got to help it. Okay, yeah, so I mentioned about 1,000 times CSS and JavaScript. They've been great. They've been blown up in the past few years. They are really useful. It feels like you're standing on the shoulders of giants when you use them. You don't need to reinvent the web every time you build a web app. I think, though, because the scenery has stabilized a bit in the past year or so, now it's a perfect time to also focus on the foundation for those two, which is HTML. And yeah, take care of its code quality as well, because it's needed for optimum user experience. That's it. Thanks for your patience, and thank you.
Thank you. We can take one question if. Yes,
Please.
You show us the demo with the keyboard. When switching keyboard, isn't this confusing for the user to not remember where the keys are, where all the signs are?
Huh. That's a very good point. I imagine that about 10 or 15 years ago, probably, yeah, that was probably the case. But now, I don't know, speaking from a first person, when I'm a user, when I type a telephone number or a credit card number, I want to see those large numeric keys, definitely. Yeah. Yes, so the audience asked when on the smaller inputs on email, when only smaller keys change. Yeah, that's also a very good use case. Only the shortcut key, so only the key from the first type of the keyboard changes. If you still want to find that dot or comma, you just type the symbols button and you can find it where you used to find it before. So just the shortcuts change. For power users, it's great. If you don't want to work with it, that's also great. You can just find it where you used to. So.
Okay, thank you, Dragos.